It's time for Hostel Discourse. Here's your host, David Rolfing.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 27 of Hostel Discourse. We are back for the new year and we are better than ever and excited to debate a few debates tonight. I just wanted to say thanks everyone last year for coming on the show if you're a guest or for watching and listening at home. We really appreciate all your support and we couldn't do it without you. You might have seen the new banner I put out on social media and I included every guest that's been on the show. I thought that was a nice way to pay tribute to everyone that's been on the show up to this point. And that brings us to a new guest tonight, Brady Pierce. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Woohoo! What's up, my dudes?
And back, as usual, the regulars, starting with Jacob Hunter in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Hello again, loyal listeners.
And Jared Cozart, straight out of the Hostel in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Hey, gang.
And last but not least, Joe Kuiper from Oklahoma City.
Hello.
Okay, so I did just mention the Hostel there, and I wanted to briefly explain what the Hostel actually is and why we call this podcast Hostel Discourse, because for the past 26 episodes, we have not explained that once to those of you who aren't from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I'll try to explain that briefly and why we named the podcast what it is. So basically, the Hostel is our former townhouse at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It has been passed down to friends for a decade now, so 10 years. It hasn't been given up to the housing lottery, not given to any randos. It's been passed down to friends over the summers in between school years. People have used it for storage or lived in there in the summer. So basically, it's our apartment, but it's also our friend group. And the two pillars of the Hostel, broship and camaraderie, are what the Hostel is built upon.
The old B&C.
So, I think one night Joe and I were brainstorming names for the podcast, and I'm pretty sure it was Joe's idea, Hostel Discourse, because we were thinking, we knew it was going to be a debate format show, and things can tend to get a little hostile when we are debating each other. So hostile and hostile kind of was a little play on words there. But Joe, thank you for coming up with such a great title that nobody knows exactly what it means, but I think it has some nice hidden value in there.
At least they know now.
Anybody else have any other hostile info they wanted to add in there?
Nothing but B and C for me.
No, I have nothing to add at the time.
And Brady actually, he didn't live at the Hostel, but he is within the Hostel Bros friend group. I think he's one of the honorary Hostel Bro members, technically.
Somewhat an adoptee or an ambassador, I think you could say.
Exactly. Okay, so tonight we'll be having 3 different debates, which are Can Dogs Think?, which should be interesting and controversial. Debate number 2 is Video Gaming a Sport? And debate number 3, Who is the best U.S. president? And this debate was actually a fan idea from Jack Parsley, who's Jacob's friend. And the caveat for this one is none of us got to choose which president we were arguing for. It was from a random selection. So that'll be a little interesting. It's the first debate where we haven't actually chosen the debate answers. I also wanted to update the debate win statistics because the last time we did it was episode 20, I believe. So as of episode 26, Joe has taken first place with 12 debate wins. He passed up Jacob.
Come get some,
Jacob has 10 debate wins. How does that make you feel, Jacob?
Confident for tonight because the reveal of these statistics can only be in my favor, or at least to the detriment of Joe.
You're right. I'm in my own head.
No one wants to affirm the overdog.
That's true.
I was the sad victim of the last time we did this, so I was skeptical, but actually before tonight I thought I was still in the lead, so I'm actually quite glad that we're looking at the stats now.
And I'm in third place with 9 debate wins. Jared has 4 in fourth place. And Drake, a guest that's been on maybe 2 or 3 times, has 2 debate wins, which he's the only guest that has more than 1 debate win. And then Emily, Cole, Chris, Tanner, Danny, Paige, Noah all have 1. So it is very rare for a first-time guest to get a debate win on their first episode, but Brady, I believe in you. and you could join the record books like the other guests tonight.
Ah, very nice.
You could almost pass up Jared.
Whatever, bro. The audience knows. I've said it once. I've said it 1,000 times. The audience knows how many times I've been wrong.
Does Chris Fisher have any wins?
He only has one, according to... I mean, David said Drake's the only one to have more than one win, which surprises me, because Chris was the first person I thought of.
I feel like he's been on a lot.
Okay, let's get into the debates. Debate number 1. Can dogs think? I will be on Joe's team for this one, and Jared and Jacob will be on a team, and Brady will be the judge for this debate. So, Brady, you can kind of dictate how things go in whatever order you want. So you can tell us who can begin their arguments first.
This is a little too much power. You know what, Jacob? You're on the far left of my Google Hangout screen. Mm-hmm. Why don't you and your team begin?
Sure.
Opening statements.
Thank you very much. As it is with any of these kinds of debates, it's going to come down to semantics. What that means is that we have to choose the definitions of our words very carefully, and we have to define think in a way that doesn't take all of the value and meaning out of it for any practical purposes or, like I said, just any valuable meaning it might have. So what that means is that dogs cannot think. Dogs cannot act outside of their like an external or internal stimulus or basically instinct. They're hardwired to act a certain way, and they can't reason on any higher order. They can't become existential. That is something that is a privilege reserved for humans, and any definition of thinking lower than that brings things like computers into effect or into the conversation. And we don't really think that those dogs and computers are the same or process in the same way. So it's you have to go by a definition of thinking that allows it to be more than just processing information and stimulus. Jared, what do you have?
Yeah, I agree with that, teammate. And let me just add a few things briefly. First is that we have to define it, like Jacob said, and a good place to start is with the dictionary, as usual. And so the first definition of to think is to have a conscious mind, to some extent of reasoning, remembering experiences, making rational decisions, etc. So, etc., it's not a good definition because it is open-ended and doesn't completely define the word. But we know that to think, you must have at least 4 things: a conscious mind, some extent of reasoning, remembering experiences, making rational decisions. In short, there's no way dogs have all 4 of those things, especially a conscious mind. They're not aware of, this goes back to what Jacob said. At best, they are subconsciously making decisions, but they're not rationalizing anything. They're not thinking through. They're not saying, these are my options, here's what I'm going to do. No, it's all subconscious. And because all of their reasoning is subconscious, they cannot possibly satisfy the definition of to think.
Very well. Could I get a couple opposing statements, Joe and David?
David, you want to go first?
Yeah, because the definitions you brought up, I believe dogs meet, therefore they can think, as well as this additional definition I wanted to read. The Oxford Dictionary definition of think: to direct one's mind towards something or someone, or to use one's mind actively to form connected ideas. I can give countless examples of my dog or other dogs doing these things to form connected ideas that aren't instinctual. Domesticated dogs can clearly think. If dogs couldn't think, they would just be acting on the instincts they naturally evolved to become from wolves and wild animals do. Naturally, a dog sees a squirrel and wants to run at it to kill it to get food. If Brody, my dog, was only acting on instinct, he would not have been able to learn to be domesticated, to learn that when he goes to the bathroom in the morning, that he gets food when he comes inside right after that. There are so many things that dogs do, that dogs remember, that dogs learn how to do, that are so much more advanced than their instincts, their natural instincts tell them to do, that I don't see how there's any way that they're not thinking. Joe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that while your definitions were decent, that obviously we're not going to argue that anything that has a brain thinks. I mean, there's anything from the most simple organism has a single neuron that's not thinking. So there definitely needs to be something conscious involved. But when it comes to emotions, I think you can divide them into two categories according to scientists. You go with the basic emotions or gut feelings and the reflective emotions requiring conscious thought. Things like fear and anxiety would fall into the former group, while guilt, pride, grief, those would fall into the latter. And mammals and dogs, in particular, have been regularly shown to be able to react to grief and to show guilt after being in trouble. And I think emotions like that can't simply be explained away by instinct. And even from the idea of having a pack of wolves where one wolf is the leader and that the others are subjugated to that lead wolf, I think even that would show that dogs are able to use social cues and that those social cues imply conscious thought.
Okay. Thank y'all. I want to touch and get a follow-up from both sides. I believe David touched on this a little bit. The difference between training and learning. I think that Jacob, you and Jared's side argues a little bit more towards the training side, whereas David, you and Joe's side argues more towards the learning side. If you could A, respond to each other's thoughts, but B, also follow up in terms of what does training a dog, how does that fit into your argument or fit against your opposition's argument?
So training and learning, I think dogs clearly can learn things, right? But yes, they must learn through experience or through being taught. But here's the catch about training and learning and what Big D was talking about. He's saying, yeah, I can think of all these examples of how dogs have learned to do things. And so this goes exactly to what you're talking about, Brady. And it's that, yes, dogs can be taught things and they can learn, but they can only be taught subconsciously, right? Like you're only training their subconscious to recognize things, right? So when you train your dog Brody or Bro Dog to, go outside every morning and he gets a treat, he's not thinking to himself, okay, if I go outside, then I will get a treat. Like that's not a rational thought in his head. It's happening in the back of his mind subconsciously. Dogs, they never have I can't prove this, although I have some evidence, but I assert that dogs aren't having the thoughts in their head. If I do this, then this will happen. Instead, they're just being trained in the back of their mind. And so that's where in the definition, conscious thought is required. And that's where, all dogs thinking that you call thinking is subconscious. And so it can't actually be considered thought.
Right. Going back to my first statement, what we have with the phenomena of dogs learning is just basically overriding their responses to stimuli. Consider Pavlov's dog. He was able to, quote unquote, teach how to salivate at the sound of a bell just by feeding him after ringing a bell all the time. That's a very similar thing to what happens with any action a dog goes through. They're not, as Jared said, there is no reasoning. It is only mindless, quote unquote, cause and effect calculation going on in the mind of an animal. There's no rationale, which is a key tenet of actual thinking.
Joe, David, do you have any follow-up response?
I would like to ask whether or not Jacob and Jared also believe that monkeys can or cannot think.
No, I don't think they can.
It's a no from me.
Okay. In that case, we will assume that they're in the animal category and therefore cannot think. But there's a very famous study done when two monkeys are placed in cages side by side. One monkey is given a delicious treat while the other is given a cucumber in response to pushing a button. And so every time the monkey pushes the button, gets a treat. The first time they give both monkeys the delicious treat. when they push the button. And then the second time, the first monkey pushes the button, gets a delicious treat. The second monkey pushes the button and gets a cucumber. And in response to this, the second monkey throws the cucumber back at the experimenter's face. And what this is shown or thought to show is that these monkeys are able to experience theory of mind and understand that they want the same rewards as the other monkey, which is not something that is subconsciously learned. It's not a classical conditioning like Pavlov's dogs were. So that experiment in itself showed that these monkeys can consciously think. And I think that if we assume that these monkeys can, that to a lesser extent other animals can. If humans aren't in their own category, I think it's safe to say that other animals would be.
I want to make sure I understand that. The proof is basically that one monkey was evaluated unequal rewards for the same action, yes. And that was proof of what's the phrase you had?
That's proof of dogs thinking, of mind. Says Joe.
No, it's proof of animal thinking. I think that that's using what we would perceive as emotion, anger, while what Joe used that as an example of thinking earlier. There's not actually like an existential aspect to that at all, which is a huge part of, which was really one of the main parts of thinking, and is still actually an instinctual reaction. Just discord between outcomes, like what Joe just showed, is just instigating anger, what looks like anger, but any animal would do that, and I refute as being proof of actual thinking.
Agreed. And I would just emphasize that there's a huge difference between rational thought or, conscious reasoning and eliciting emotions.
I read several articles today about MRIs and brain scans of humans compared to dogs, and a lot of processing in the brain and the brain waves in very similar areas and lobes of the brain between humans and dogs are surprisingly similar when reacting to many different types of stimuli. So I think that that's another kind of evidence that the thinking that humans do compared to the thinking that animals do are not that different. But I'm a little confused. You say that existential thinking, you said subconscious thinking is all dogs do. So they're not thinking existentially or consciously. Are those kind of three different levels? Or are you saying there's subconscious thinking and then everything else is existential thinking and they don't have that?
Jared and I might be on different pages with this, but I think existential thought is proof of conscious thought. Not really, I wouldn't call them different levels, but like you can't subconsciously be aware of yourself in any meaningful way, like you aren't aware of the soul or the mind. Yeah, I think the two levels, quote unquote, are conscious and subconscious.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I agree with all of that.
And I would say the fact that dogs only think subconsciously means that, of course, you would be able to find examples of humans and dogs thinking, quote unquote, by your definition, in the exact same ways, because humans are unique in that they are both conscious and subconscious. So we surpass dogs in that way. We still also think subconsciously all the time. You could run all these same experiments that you would on dogs to prove that they can think, and you're going to have some sort of similar reaction from a human, unless it's something really weird. And I couldn't really think of an example off the top of my head, but you could run a Pavlov's dog style experiment on a human and get the exact same reaction. A similarity between something that thinks and something that doesn't does not mean that the other one thinks.
I think kind of my final statement would be, yeah, maybe I kind of agree with you that dogs could learn certain things still that are subconscious, but some things that dogs do, like manipulating owners by looking sad and pouting to give them food or to do certain things. I just think that there's a certain level of thought that's conscious from dogs, that they know they're doing something in order to get something. And there's no way that that's just instinctual. But besides that, I don't really have anything else. Joe, do you have a concluding statement?
I think that the act of reasoning indicates conscious thought to me. And there's been many experiments done where you put a treat on a string or put treats in a bottle, and given enough time, a dog will solve the problem. And also another study was done where it was like comparing wolves to dogs, and compared to wolves, dogs, when presented with a difficult problem, will instead look back at the human. And I guess you could say that subconsciously or instinctually they know that the human will solve the problem for them. But I think it's more likely to me that they have learned over time that humans will solve the problems for them and are using that recall of memory to say this human will now solve this problem for me, especially because instinctually I don't think there's anything in nature that would imply that humans would solve their problems. So it's something that either they've evolved a new instinct since we domesticated dogs, or it's something that they've learned over time.
Cool.
I'll say that what Joe and David brought forward are just a lot of examples of things that look like thinking, and they look like things that people do. And I think that's why they consider them thinking. But it's just not the case, because considering the way animals act, there's no way they are rational beings. Animals are actually wildly unpredictable and irrational on a level way more frequent than humans are, if you want to use that as any sort of indicator. And the idea of a dog looking to its owner to solve problems for him, animals are just like, especially pack animals like dogs, are instinctually subservient. In their instincts is an understanding of authority, quote unquote understanding. And for that to be thinking, there has to be an idea of, you have to have an actual proof that a dog could, I don't know how to say this in a way that I haven't said it before. We have no way to believe that dogs understand themselves on a higher level because they can't talk, which is really the main reason why we have this. Like, dogs can't talk. They don't have language. They just go about their business doing things, feeding themselves, excrementing, and receiving stimuli like petting or soothing tones from humans. That we'll use words to talk to dogs and tell them they're good. A dog enjoys it. That doesn't mean that the dog understands that it is good. Those are just sounds that are nurturing to a dog, activating a stimulus. That is instinct. That's the sum of all actions that an animal goes through, especially domesticated ones. So there's no proof and there's no reason to believe that dogs can actually think.
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly, Jacob, I'd like to emphasize the point he made that dogs do a lot of things that really resemble thinking. But the trick in my mind is that it is all subconscious thinking. There's no conscious reasoning going on. They're trained subconsciously. They learn subconsciously. They certainly aren't conscious in the sense of being aware of having a self or whatever that means. You know what I mean? And so the definition from the dictionary that I gave earlier, in which Big D agreed was a good definition to use. To me, there's just no way to make the conscious part work when we're talking about conscious reasoning and thinking. So I love my dog Zeus, but he's just a dumb animal. No, he's not. I love him. He's a smart animal, but he's dumb.
Brady, can I add in one thought?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Before your final decision. Okay. I just think that there's no scientific way to prove our own existentialism or our own consciousness. Nobody's come up with a way to prove that yet. So I think the only way we can look to see if dogs are thinking is to see what they do and what looks like thinking. So I'll just add that.
And I would add that both of you said dogs do a lot of things that look like thinking. So I think at worst we're talking about the fact that we can't say whether they think or not, in which case neither of us win. But there's been MRI brain scans and frontal lobe detection and all that kind of stuff done on dogs to say that there's something activated there. And if monkeys have theory of mind, like the experiment I was talking about earlier, then it's safer to say there's a spectrum. So at worst, we're both wrong. At best, we're right.
I guess those are differing definitions of what thinking is, talking about theory of mind. But I guess to say that, talking about the brain scan thing, I'll just say again that subconscious brain activity does not mean thinking. That is where we're going to differ on our definitions of thinking. And I think Jared and I have put forward just a better definition of thinking. I'll leave it in the judge's hands.
Okay, Brady, what do you think? Who brought forth the better argument?
I think both groups bring up valid points. As myself being a large fan of dogs, as y'all know, it pains me to side on that they can't think, because that discredits them. But on a different hand, I'm going to have to go with the Jacob and Jared side on this one, and here's why. I do think, as it stands currently, humans come pridefully and determine what thinking is. And thinking as a human does involve a large semblance of consciousness, involves a large semblance of reasoning, and involves an amount of independent thought that can fight back against Pavlovian response or training and stuff like that. I would agree that humans are one of the few animals that seem to be capable of those things, and I would argue that dogs themselves have been bred out of the wild to be subservient and to obey orders without thinking and without fighting and without rebellion. And so, through no fault of their own, I would argue that dogs cannot necessarily reason and they cannot necessarily have a conscience. I wouldn't say they can't think. Like Jacob said, this comes down to a difference in think. But I think they can respond. I think they can reason, but I think they lack any existential and any conscious decision making. And for that reason, I will argue that Jared and Jacob have kind of won this debate in terms of dogs cannot think as humans define the broad scope of thinking.
All right. I'm one closer to Big Joe.
Congrats.
By the end of this night, I'll be back on top.
And I am one farther from last.
Oh, there you go.
Chris is listening on the live stream, and he said B, his dog, is listening and is very offended by Jacob and Jared's ignorance. So
literally impossible.
Right there, we have evidence that dogs think.
If that's true, big if true, I say. Big if true, because that would pretty much do us in.
Yeah.
All right. On to debate number 2. Is video gaming a sport? And I'm teaming up with Jacob. We are arguing that it is a sport. Brady and Joe are arguing that gaming is not a sport. Jared will be judging. So Jared, go for it.
Okay. Let me hear the affirmative first. Video gaming is a sport. What you got?
Yeah, so I'll start off with the definition, kind of like last debate. The Oxford Dictionary definition of sport: an activity involving physical exertion and skill in which an individual or team competes against another or others for entertainment. I believe gaming meets all of these criteria, yes, including physical exertion. There's lots of muscle memory involved in gaming that you have to learn in order to execute strategic plans. I mean, there's plenty more points I want to go through, but at the core, it meets this definition.
Yeah, I think David really hit the nail on the head, especially with the idea of executing. So a sport is really it has to be three things. It has to be a competition. So there's winner and losers. It has to be based on an objective score or as close as possible to it. And then thirdly, it has to be, the score has to be determined on physical execution. So some video games, like a turn-based game like Pokemon, is not necessarily a sport in that the competition isn't based on how well you can press those buttons and in what order. It's based more on the evaluation and the strategy. That is not a sport. If you looked at a fighting game, it actually fulfills all the definitions of a sport in ways way better than any of the big four in America could, because when you introduce automated, computed scorekeeping, it is the most objective kind of sporting, and so in a way, a really pure type of competition. And although the execution required is on a really small scale compared to some of the sports we watch today, it can't be counted out on any basis of definition, only by general distaste. So that would not be a good or reasonable way to do that. So esports stay as sports.
Very good. Good opening statement. Let's hear team video gaming not a sport?
Okay. I think that the definition online is acceptable, at least to me. But the point of contention for me in that definition is going to be the physical exertion, particularly the exertion. And my argument, I guess, is more that exertion implies a giving of effort, and that the more effort that you give gets you a greater reward, or that the exertion will in time wear you down. And I think that esports, while physical because you're moving your hand, are not exerting. They're not an example of exertion. And moving your hands around on a controller do not necessarily wear a person down to the point where they are no longer able to do that, in the same way that playing chess for hours on end does not wear down your hands, even though you are making physical acts while you do it. Pointing and clicking, or putting together strings of moves, while impressive, are more mental and not so much physical to me. But that's my argument.
I would honestly tack on my argument to Joe's and say that, similar to most sports, the physical exertion and the training needed tends to result in a healthier individual. And I would argue that 12 hours of training for what most human beings would think of as sport versus 12 hours of training for an e-sport looks very different. And I would also argue that those 12 hours of training for an e-sport would almost be detrimental to health due to your hands, due to posture, due to eye exertion, looking at a screen for 12 hours. I would argue that those are almost detrimental to your health rather than being beneficial, and don't, like Joe said, indicate a physical exertion that results in an improvement of what was exerted. I think there are numerous studies to support that sitting all day in your office doesn't result in you being a better sitter, and staring at a screen all day doesn't make your eyes any better. And so, at least in Joe's opening statement, I would argue that certain aspects of training for esports is detrimental to health.
Okay. Very good. Let's hop into rebuttals, and then we'll go from there. So, open floor.
Okay, I'd like to take the first rebuttal. So there are many, I think, contradictory points in those two statements. So, Joe, you mentioned that gaming doesn't break down your muscls in any way or something like that because you're not exerting yourself. I have personal experience from gaming literally breaking down my thumb muscles in college because we played so much Minecraft and zombies that I had to ice them like every day. You probably remember me in Fisher South dorm putting my hand in like buckets of ice from gaming, for sure gaming. So you can get injuries from gaming because you really are exerting your fingers and your hands to execute quickly and at a super high level, especially for professional gaming athletes. And then Brady, you mentioned sports having a beneficial impact on your health. There are plenty of sports out there that have major detrimental impacts on your health. Combat sports, for one, have detrimental impacts on health long term over the course of a fighter's career, on their brain health, on their body from injuries from fights. Other sports, I'm sure, cause injuries. I can't think of any off the top of my head right now, but I think those are my two main rebuttals to those. And we're kind of focusing on the physical exertion right now, but I think that's kind of where the controversy lies. Yeah. So we can stay there for now.
I understood Brady's point to be more about the training. And so I think a fighter's training, you could train in a really similar way, and not have to deal with any of that trauma. But at least as sports as we know them now, like I'm thinking of golf, which maybe we can, if y'all don't think golf is a sport, I'll gladly debate that on another episode. But the training alone is super strenuous on your joints. It's how we saw the greatest of all time, Tiger Woods, fall into terrible health as an athlete. I don't see proof of a net health gain being a core part of a sport. I see them being really highly correlated, but the way I'm looking at it, that's more of a societal point that we're at. Just all the sports that we enjoy have a health gain to them. And I think those are just so associated that could be why video games could be considered a sport. But I think when you get down to the actual meaning of things and what a sport actually is, I think the net health increase falls to the wayside and no longer is part of that equation anymore.
I would like to ask if you guys believe that Hungry Hungry Hippos is a sport.
Yep.
Do you believe that chess is a sport?
No.
I'd agree with Jacob's answers.
Okay, well, I was hoping you'd say no, Hungry Hungry Hippos, but it applies to chess as well. If I play chess for 10 hours straight, at the end of the day, my arm's going to be tired from lifting and moving pieces back and forth. And if I play it on a computer, my hand will also be tired from clicking a mouse. And I think all of us would agree that that's a competition. And yet at the end of the day, that can wear you down or induce pain. But physical exertion, I think, has to do more with the body's inability to continue, not due to rubbing on something, but simply due to like muscle failure. So I guess that's more where I was going with the exertion. But at the same time, the other point I wanted to bring up was that I think sport and athleticism are something that go together, in the fact that in order to improve at a sport, you need to be more athletic, or the more athletic you are, the better you will be at a given sport compared to what you would be if you were less athletic. And I think that because that logic does not actually apply to esports is an argument for why it's not a sport. I should stop calling it esports because I don't think it is an esport. But so the point that like athleticism, the more athletic you are, the better you'll be at a given sport. But in video games, being more athletic will not necessarily make you a better gamer. It won't make you, I don't know. I mean, you look at the people who play games and who are super good, and they're clearly not athlete. And I know we have all these crazy definitions of athleticism going on in this group, and we'll probably would end up getting back to that. But I think most people at home would agree with some of our definitions of athlete presented previously, and that gamers are not necessarily athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up and argue, kind of revise my statement that I said earlier, and argue that a typical training regimen of a sport is done, that most sports can be accomplished by amateurs in order to improve their general health. I would say that I could go out and join a men's rec league football team to get more in shape. I could even join a sport that is detrimental to health at a professional level, like boxing or like UFC, and go to a place like that and be a part of that sport, and yet not garner any negative side effects that come from a professional level. But I would argue, I guess revising my statement, that even the amateur levels of the sport do not necessarily give the person who's playing them any kind of physical benefit. Physical, now we can argue about mental benefit and social benefit and stuff like that, but physical benefit, I would argue it doesn't give anything like that. So yeah, David, I will concede your point about UFC, football. I would say that most sports at the highest level are probably not necessarily good for the human body to the extent that the highest level athletes push them. But I would say that at an amateur level, most sports do provide the participants some sort of physical improvement, in which esports does not, much like Joe said, chess or Hungry Hungry Hippos.
I'd like to address Joe's point, one of his points real quick. So you mentioned athleticism not having any effect on gaming. I think that reaction time and I guess reflexes are a big part of gaming and also a big part of athleticism. And I think that there are people that are better gamers, especially games that require quick reaction time executed through muscle memory or through moving your fingers, whatever. I just think that reaction time, which is a part of overall athleticism, is important in gaming. So I don't think you're giving that enough credit there.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, I think increased health is the wrong standard. I think I would revise your point of view to say to a sport, when you play it as an amateur, to get better at it means to improve your athleticism. Part of that means what David said, reaction time. Overall, your body will be able to do things that it couldn't, and in an increased fashion. It's not like you could do something slower than you ever could. Well, maybe, I don't know. That could be a sport too. But if your precision is increasing and if your reaction time is increasing, that is a net gain on athleticism, although your health might actually decrease. And I guess that's a really interesting dichotomy I wasn't expecting to get on this debate, but I still stand by my side, although this is a lot more fun to think about. Anyway, I think that's what I got.
That is very interesting. You guys have provided many good points. Please, each team, sum up the very last things you want me to have in my head before I judge this debate in 30 seconds. Who started first?
They did.
Jacob and I started.
Okay, so you got first word, so they'll get the last word. And Jacob and you, please start final statements again.
I'll just say we've had two ideas kind of being used interchangeably. Like Joe used Hungry Hippos and chess. I think you have to make sure that those are separate in your head. Chess isn't a sport because your win or loss isn't based on your physical actions. It's based on your strategic choices. Hungry Hippos would actually be based on your physical actions. As stupid of a sport as it would be, that is the crucial difference between them. So what we're calling a sport is only a competition where the outcome's determined by activity, not decision. And then David, bring it home. Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't even touch upon video games like Dance Dance Revolution or Guitar Hero or Rock Band that definitely require a lot of physical exertion, and DDR was at the professional level, and I would consider a sport with extreme conditioning required and physical exertion. It's just other games like a shooter doesn't require as much exertion, but there definitely is exertion required of the hands and of the body, and needing focus and strategy and muscle memory and reflexes and reaction time. And I just think that all of these things combined definitely meet the definition's criteria of physical exertion, and as well as, of course, the other parts of the definition of competition and entertainment. So I will end with that.
Oh, Brady and Joe, take us home.
Joe, I'll take it first. I would argue that esports trying to sandwich itself in what is traditionally thought of as a sport is an incorrect push. I would argue it follows the same lines of something like WWE or monster truck racing or chess or some other type of genre of competition. Not to argue it doesn't share similarities with things on both sides, nor not to say that it doesn't garner an immense following or a lot of monetary compensation. However, I do think that esports in and of itself does not fit what the classic established definition of a sport is. And I think it would be better off to pioneer its own brand rather than try to sandwich itself in.
Joe, anything to add?
Yeah.
Joe?
Yeah. To me, like I said earlier, this whole point about athleticism as a correlate to sportiness, sportsiosity. A piece of anecdotal evidence for you, which I know Jared probably hates, but I'm going to give it anyway because I like doing it. My friend Thomas is probably the most athletic person I know, and yet also the single worst person I know at video games. And I hope if you're listening, you don't take that personally, Thomas. But I think that there's an aspect of video games that is beyond the realm of athleticism, and separates it from sports and the fact that athleticism makes you better at sports, whereas it does not apply to the realm of video games. And I think reaction time, maybe you can make the argument that that is part of athleticism, but maybe it's just more a mental part of it. I don't know. I guess that's up for debate as well. But I think that the whole idea of athleticism affecting it makes it not a sport.
Very interesting stuff, fellas. Thinking. I have come to a decision. And my mind has been, not only have I come to a decision about who won this debate, but I have been convinced of one side.
Oh, wow.
Oh, you no longer think it's a sport?
That's correct. No, that's not correct. That's not correct.
No, hey, you said it.
That's not correct. Jacob and David are the winners of this debate.
Oh, yeah.
One more
And
on the board.
let me explain. You know, a lot of this came down to, I thought a big chunk of this argument came down to exertion and what does it mean to exert and all this stuff. And Brady and Joe, if you guys could have established some kind of framework that for a sport, I like to call them thresholds. Jacob hates this, but if you could have established some kind of more objective threshold of exertion that a sport has to meet to be considered a sport, that would have been great. But I didn't get that, and they gave a definition, and they had a really, really sound argument. Brady, your detrimental health argument was very interesting, but you got a little too qualified with it for me to really get on board. You know, as most sports that are professional or whatever. So it was a little too qualified. And the last thing I have to say is, you guys also, Brady and Joe, you mentioned kind of, we have a classic connotation of sport. I think that's true. And I think that our classic connotation is sports with extreme exertion like football or basketball, where you have to run really fast and jump really high and be really strong. But it's purely connotation, I think. And I think they provided the dictionary definition and proved that it met all its criteria. So winners are Jacob and Big D, and I believe that esports are sports, albeit like the lowest level of sports. Exertion is so low. So they qualify, but not very much.
Yes, this is great, because I think once you really start to buy in on this framework, golf soon becomes the most athletic sport. I think this is almost the cornerstone idea, understanding what a sport is.
Get out. I want to read a couple of points from the live chat on YouTube. Chris said, to me, the difference is that esports are played on a different platform. It's not a part of the literal definition, but my personal subconscious definition requires that the actual competition takes place in the physical realm, not in a projected virtual platform. So that's a little interesting, but I would disagree. And then Levi Strodman said, being more athletic is absolutely acknowledged as a benefit in modern competitive gaming. Good rest and hydration are great examples and current necessities for attaining high-level performance.
Yeah, they're just super lame examples.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for judging, Jared. Let's move on to debate number 3, brought to us by Jack Parsley. Who is the best U.S. president? So we used a random number generator, 0 to 45, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Probably 1 to 45, hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay, sharp point.
The presidents that were randomly allocated to us. Joe scored Abraham Lincoln.
Who?
You bet I did.
Brady scored Warren G. Harding. Jacob got Benjamin Harrison.
Darn right.
And Jared got Ronald Reagan.
The big man himself.
So I'll be judging this debate, and I will not rely on any previous knowledge, and will just listen to what the debaters have to offer. So let's start with Jared. Ronald Reagan. Why is he the best U.S. president?
Well, the president's duties go in this order. Being the commander-in-chief, being a good leader of people, and thirdly, being a good leader of policy. You'll find that Ronald Reagan was excellent in all 3 categories. as the commander-in-chief, he won what was probably, I wonder if historians debate this, but I would say it has to be the greatest threat to America's history. I mean, maybe to the world since America was founded, and that is the Cold War, nuclear crisis. Nuclear weapons were nearly fired, and he protected the country as the commander-in-chief's job, and he won the Cold War, averting nuclear crisis. A leader of people, Reagan is known. He was obviously an actor and great in the camera. He had extreme charisma, and there are numerous examples that I'll get into later of his leadership of people. And third is policy. And, probably the biggest part of policy for a president is economics and the economy. And Reagan is known for a certain brand of economics. And during his tenure, that brand of economics worked wonders. And I guess I'll save my stats for rebuttal and stuff and expansion. But I'll just leave it at now he was a great leader of policy and the economy flourished under him.
Awesome. Thank you. Let's go with Jacob next.
All right. Benjamin Harrison was the 23rd president, and here's why he was the best president. Without
Michael Jordan's number?
Without doing anything wrong, he made the most powerful and lasting, enjoyed contributions to America. I'm using the word legacy for this. The things he did have stood the test of time and have effects that are almost unanimously enjoyed by Americans. In my follow-up statement, I'll go into what those mean, but a few of his accomplishments that aren't necessarily contributions were he defeated an incumbent, a notoriously difficult thing to do, and he saw 6 states added to the Union, which was huge. So as we go through this debate, I hope to make it more clear that, first of all, he was moral, if not at the very least rightly ethical, but he also made the most lasting, valuable contributions to America.
Thank you. Okay, Brady.
I have President Harding. On paper, maybe not the most optimum choice. However, severely underrated president. He inherited a difficult post-war period. He inherited a Prohibition era America, very difficult time in American history, and yet was a man of the people. He was a politician for a very short time. I would almost argue, with my limited knowledge, somewhat like Reagan in terms of very quick progression into the presidency. And he won the popular vote into the presidency by a large margin. And personal issues aside, ushered in a substantial economic boom for the United States in the early 1920s. He's often kind of given the shaft in terms of presidents, but I would argue that the truth is slightly more optimistic than assumed.
Great. Joe, last but not least, with Abe.
Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States. If you don't know who he is and what he did, then you are either a horrible citizen of the United States or not a citizen at all, in which case, welcome to the podcast. And I, too, have a few criteria that I think make for the greatest president, but they differ from Jared's. I think first you have to have an opportunity arise. And I think every president will have an opportunity arise to make a difference, make an impact. But I think no opportunity was greater than that presented to Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. And second, I think you have to rise up to that opportunity and succeed in overcoming it. And third, you have to have a lasting impact. And I think all three of those were met by Abraham Lincoln, and I'll get to those later. But also, as anecdote, 6 out of 7 places polled put Abraham Lincoln as the number 1 greatest president, and the 7th put him at 2nd, only behind George Washington, who is not in this debate.
All right. The floor is open to rebuttals or further expansions on your Presidente.
I'll start, and then...
I also wish one of you got number 45. That would have been good.
Would have been great.
Would have been tough. Small sample size. I'll start with explaining mine a little bit more and then rebutting Joe real hard and real fast. Benjamin Harrison did a few things that were really important and kind of behind the scenes a little bit. But overall, he's actually way more important than you might give him credit for. Part of it is what I mentioned earlier. He saw 6 states added to the Union, which was awesome. Those were both Dakotas, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and Hawaii was annexed but not made a state. I don't know how that works. But also, he enacted the Sherman Antitrust Act, which is one of the great reasons why America is still functioning as any sort of capitalist society and still gets to enjoy the wealth that capitalism provides without having to deal with such harsh monopolies. He also basically paved the way for national forest reserves through amendment to the Land Revision Act of 1891. So a lot of like national forests can be attributed to this Benjamin Harrison, who, looking back now, is kind of strange to see that he was a Republican. He also was a very moral president. He fought a losing battle for voting rights for African Americans and civil rights battles in general. He, till the end of his term, was staunchly in support of a really noble cause that he continually saw beaten down, which speaks to his resolve and his morale in general. So I think that gives a more complete picture of Benjamin Harrison. I will also say Joe wrapped up his opening statement with something called appeal to majority, basically saying that most people think that Abraham Lincoln's the best, so that must mean he is the best, or at least that should be a reason that he should be considered as being the best. It's just not true. It's a fallacy.
Whoa! Hey.
It's a phallus.
It's very
That's a funny joke. Hey, I'm in this thing.
Oh.
He in it.
I'm in this thing, Judge. I will also let me expand on my points, and then I'm going to go at Joe as well. So
yeah, you better.
Let's talk about the economy for a moment under Reagan. When Jimmy Carter left office, who was Reagan's predecessor, inflation was at 12.5%, which is ridiculously high. That's inflation. The Federal Reserve's target inflation is like 2%. So 12.5 is like, that is terrible news for the United States. When Reagan left office, inflation was at 4.5%. Unemployment had declined from 7.5% to 5.5%, and GDP grew at an average of 3.5%, with a high of 8.5%, which are pretty crazy numbers. So I think Reagan is probably most well known for his economics, maybe, but those numbers make pretty clear that out of the 4 presidents here, his policy was the best. Now, let's get back to Commander-in-Chief for a second. And remember, the president's first and foremost job is to protect American citizens. Well, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln for a second. A little over 1 million American soldiers have died since 1776. Half of that number, 620,000, died in the Civil War. So...
Wait, that many died in wars, you mean?
American soldiers have died in wars, yeah.
Okay. I thought you just said Americans have died. It's like, I think...
Have died in wars. And 620,000 died in the Civil War alone. That's half of all American soldier deaths. So you could say that Lincoln is responsible for 620,000 American soldier deaths.
Oh, man.
He absolutely failed in his primary role to protect Americans. He killed... he didn't kill, but he was responsible.
Jeez.
He was responsible.
I didn't think you were going to go
for half
so
of
far
the deaths,
so fast.
half of all American soldier deaths, okay? Now, compare that to Reagan. Reagan prevented nuclear war. Okay, imagine nuclear war between Russia and America. I have no idea how many Americans would have died. Let's estimate 10 million. Okay, so that means that the count between Reagan and Lincoln in protecting Americans is Reagan is up by a margin of about 10,620,000 American lives. So from the perspective of protecting Americans, which is the president's primary calling or responsibility as the commander-in-chief, Lincoln failed and Reagan wildly succeeded.
I can go next. While we're on the topic of fallacies, or fallacies, as it should be put, the idea that correlation equals causation in Jared's argument just doesn't hold up, because while 600,000 deaths did indeed happen during Abraham Lincoln's presidency, those were not the direct result of his failure as a president. In fact, like I said earlier, that presented the exact opportunity, which I explained earlier was a prerequisite for being a great president. And it was the opportunity that he rose up to in order to bring a nation at literally its most broken after 600,000 men and women killed each other, which was not present in any other war, and take that nation and somehow keep it together and rebuild it until he was untimely assassinated. And I think that opportunity is what makes him such a great leader, because he held that nation together. And I think you would have to be a fool to believe that Abraham Lincoln killed those 600,000 men. Also, in response to something Jacob said earlier, at the beginning of the arguments, he said that his president gave us something that I think we all enjoy. And you know what I enjoy is freedom. And no president gave us something that we all enjoy more than Abraham Lincoln did with the Emancipation Proclamation and giving us our freedom. And I think that is something we all enjoy and is pretty big deal. And also, as just a moralistic person, Abraham Lincoln was literally known as Honest Abe. And that's one of the coolest things that you can be known as, which just points to his moral character. And I think that's a crucial part of being a great president.
I would argue that both Jared and Joe, that wartime presidents always have a boost in popularity. Yeah, it's a well-known fact. Bush's approval rating jumped some like 50% when he went into the Iraq War. Similarly, leaders who exist in times of strife, not to discount what they do, generally have a higher approval rating than those who exist in times of peace. Now, Jared, your comments on Reagan, yes, he did usher in economic change, which is up for debate pretty fiercely, his particular brand of economics. However, his reduction of inflation and his increase in GDP was almost entirely due to his Federal Reserve chair, who increased interest to almost an extreme amount during his tenure and then dropped it suddenly to both lower the inflation and then increase employment and large purchase and GDP. Your comment about his incredible GDP increase, I will say that Warren Harding during 1922 grew the GDP 14%. You were pretty impressed by 8.5%, 14% in 1 year.
That's insane.
That's pretty mind-boggling, to be honest. He dropped the unemployment during his presidency from 11.7% to 2.4%. The man had a 2-year presidency because he worked so hard he died of a heart attack in 23. He ushered in an economic boom for the United States and was not afraid to get his hands dirty and recover from the recession that gripped the United States. So, well, just kidding. That's the wrong timeline. Scratch that. Mark that. The fact remains, though, that he ushered in absurdly large growth of the GDP, a significant decrease of the unemployment, cut the tax, cut the federal budget nearly in half during his tenure, and that was all accomplished within roughly 2 to 2.5 years.
Wow.
I don't know if I have another point. I was gonna start digging into Reagan, but then I'd be talking about a lot of stuff I don't know anything about. And then reading off an article called 21 Reasons Why Ronald Reagan Was a Terrible President that starts with Reagan supplied weapons to America's enemies, which seems like a pretty bad thing. But I will say, I used to be pretty scared by this part of the Wikipedia article for Benjamin Harrison that said, although many have praised Harrison's commitment to African Americans' voting rights, scholars and historians generally regard his administration as below average and rank him in the bottom half among U.S. presidents. The reasons for ranking Harrison there are way less bad than supplying weapons to America's enemies. I think you have to consider the worst parts of these presidents when you're looking at them and evaluating the best. And Harrison's were really just, if anything, he didn't do that much. What he did was good. He didn't really do anything bad. Overall, didn't do a whole lot, which I think should be way more commendable than bottom half of presidencies.
Interesting stance to take there, Jacob.
Well,
if I could have,
I was hoping that would prompt a little more discussion, but oh well.
Yeah. 30-second final statements, please. Let's start with Joe.
Look, these other presidents, I feel like we didn't really take down Ronald Reagan too much, but he was known for having multiple failures. Failure in Lebanon when he sent in Marines, and there were large mistakes made on the military side of that, and also a few of his nominations, like Robert Bork, who is known to be a failure, just kind of chalked up to failures on his part. And then just to make sure that Brady doesn't somehow sneak in for the win, good old Harding was known for the Teapot Dome scandal, in which he basically one of his officials took the federal land and used it to make a profit, which was a horrible scandal, one of the bigger ones known in the White House, and he went to prison for it. And Harding obviously was associated with that. And Malcolm Gladwell actually coined an effect called the Harding effect, which is where you think a president's going to be good just because he looks stately, and it's because everyone thought Harding would be a good president, and he turned out not to be. Anyway, Abraham Lincoln, GOAT. Thank him for everyone being equal.
Brady, I'll let you respond to that jab and give your 30-second final statement.
Again, I will stick by when you have a election where you win 60% of the popular vote, pleasing 60% of any group of people is nearly impossible. And so I think that gives a setup to some type of disappointment from a majority. I will again state that the GDP growth, tax reductions, federal budget reductions, unemployment reductions, an economic boom that Harding ushered in more than make up for some of his shortcomings morally and business on the side that Joe pointed out.
Scandal.
All right. I think next is Jared.
Okay, very good, very good. Just to recap my 3 big points. You need to be a good commander-in-chief, need to be a good leader of people, need to be a good leader of policy. And Judge Man, Big D, you might be thinking, well, you didn't say anything about people. And I'll just leave people at this. It's very well documented that, it's just kind of well known that Reagan is one of the most charismatic presidents we've ever had. But I didn't talk about it much because it's hard to prove, being a leader of people and getting people on your side or whatever. It's easy to talk about numbers, and it's easy to talk about lives and things like that. So, and to address, a few things that Brady and Joe said about Reagan. Joe saying that, and Brady kind of said this too, that, causation and correlation and all this stuff. Well, you have to judge a president by what happens under his watch and by what he has, at least some influence over, okay? And so, for example, the economy. No president can snap his fingers and make the unemployment rate go from, 7 to 5. Can't make inflation go from 12 to 5 or whatever it was. But you can appoint people. You can appoint competent people. And Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Fed, to which Brady referred, was appointed by Reagan himself. So that's an example of Reagan making good decisions about who he appoints, and it had objectively positive effects on the economy. And then I go back to my biggest point about commander-in-chief. He averted the Cold War crisis, and basically 0 American soldiers died in comparison with how many soldiers died under Lincoln's presidency. So all those make Reagan the best president of all time, the GOAT, the boat, well, whatever, you get it.
Okay, thank you. Jacob, final statement.
I think you need to open your mind to the idea that the best president may not have been the greatest president. Benjamin Harrison is going to be one that slides under the radar, but you will be surprised at how much of a part of your life he actually was, even 100 years posthumously. I'll remind you of the 6 states he added to the Union, as well as the National Forest Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which are all huge parts of American life, as I've expressed already. But there's really not all that sinister to say about this guy. While there may be some of that to say of all of the others, I think really this needs to come down to a comparison of the things you can count against a president, because of that power, the negative effects last a lot longer and are more powerful and more potent. So for that reason, Benjamin Harrison is humbly the best president of all time.
All right. This is not an easy debate to judge. There's lots of different things going on here. Let me think. Okay. 4th place, Jacob.
Yeah, bring it on home right there.
Yeah. Jacob, I was honestly... You were in the running for winning until you, nobody had even taken your guy down at all until that one argument where you were taking yourself down. So,
well,
that really hurt you there.
That was a strategic decision that backfired. I thought that was going to open up to a lot more conversation, and then we could have talked about all the terrible things there are to say about the other 3 options, and then no one would have had anything to say about my guy. And then it really would have been clear that my argument was the best. But a crucial part of that plan just straight up did not happen. And I ended up with the least confident argument I think that has ever been made on this podcast.
Okay, and that leads me to 3rd place, Brady. So you're actually giving some good points, and until Joe brought up the
teapot dome scandal.
Yes, that kind of took you down in the ranks a little bit. But everything else, the economic gains and everything, were comparable to Reagan's. So that was impressive, especially in the 2 years in which he was president before he died. But you get 3rd place. So this leads me to 1st place between Ronald Reagan and Abraham Lincoln. Jared, I liked your argument. Lincoln failed as a commander-in-chief by letting the Civil War happen and letting 600,000 people die. Pretty much he was a murderer.
Basically killed him.
Joe, I liked your point that Lincoln really gave us the thing that we enjoy the most as Americans, which is our freedom through the Emancipation Proclamation. But I'm going to give Jared the win. I think his argument as a whole was more solid. He gave his definition. He explained how it met each portion of that definition. And Joe, you didn't give that many examples of why Abe is the best besides handling the Civil War well. 6 out of 7 polls, people liked him as the best president. I just didn't think your argument was as solid as it could have been. So I'm giving the win to Jared. Congratulations.
Bang, bang, pow!
Oh, man.
Let's go.
Thank goodness.
Jared's fan club will be most happy.
They will. No angry mob today,
all
boys.
2 of them.
No angry mob.
Well, great debates, everybody, tonight. And thank you, live chat on YouTube, for chiming in and participating in tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Shout out to Chris Fisher, my boy.
And thank you, Brady, for coming on as a first-time guest. I know you are also a long-time listener, so I'm sure it was a dream come true. Am I right?
Dream come true. They always do. Thanks for having me, my dudes.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcome. One thing I wanted to mention, we have Hostel Discourse t-shirts. Nobody's wearing it right now, but I know we do wear them as much as we can in public, try to spread the good news. I'll be posting the t-shirt prices and pictures on our social media platforms shortly, and you can DM us on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter, and we can put in another order for shirts if we have enough demand. And yeah, so keep an eye out for those. Besides that, make sure to leave us a rating on iTunes, and we'll be back in 2 weeks. And we are excited for all the shows to come in 2018. So thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So long.
Thanks for listening to Hostel Discourse. Subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. And check out our other social media accounts linked in the show notes. Join us next time for more inexhaustible debate over the most questionable of topics.